Mr. Attorney General, thanks for being with us. You're here with a delegation of Attorney Generals. You've first visited Poland. Tell us about your trip so far.
Well, I'm leading a bipartisan delegation of state attorneys general to Israel, but we thought it was really important for people to get the context of Israel. You can't understand that until you have a clear context of the Holocaust. So we went to Auschwitz and saw the very, very worst of humanity, and the absolute, the attempted destruction of the Jewish people. And then we got to then fly from Poland the next day to come to Israel, where we saw, as they're really the only functioning democracy in the Middle East, the very best, some of the very best of humanity. And I thought that was a very powerful symbolism of that, to go from so much witnessing what was the place of so much death and destruction to coming to a place that was a rebirth of the nation of Israel. So it's been a very powerful and moving trip.
Yeah. Was that your first time to Auschwitz-Birkenau? And if so, what kind of impact did it have on you?
You know, you read about it and then you go, and then you see what shocked me the most was the size and scope. You see the acres and acres and acres of land. It's larger than a college campus. That it was set up as an industrial size plan to just exterminate an entire race of people. It was like staring at the face of evil. And so that is what left such an impression with me, is the depth and the breadth of this mass murder and an attempt to exterminate an entire race of people. And then to come here, when you fly in to Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion and you look down and you see this, what didn't exist 100 years ago. And this miracle of the modern Jewish state and what they had built out of nothing. It really is a modern day miracle, and to revive a dead language in Hebrew and everything they have now become as a democracy. It's an amazing experience.
And now they're celebrating 75 years as a modern state.
75 years, and so it's very special, the symbolism of going there. And then also as a state attorney general, we refer to ourselves, at least in Virginia, I refer to myself as the people's protector. And that's and we're here to protect your religious liberty, your civil rights, your individual dignity, and to go seeing in Nazi-occupied Poland the worst violation of human dignity you can imagine, to a modern state, a modern thriving democracy. I think it's a great symbolism.
How important was it to have a bipartisan group of attorney generals here?
Well, I just don't think Israel should ever be a partisan issue. I think it's something that both parties should broadly agree on and support. Sadly, we're seeing a little fraying on the edges there, and so I thought it was important to have a combination of Republicans and Democrats together to talk about anti-Semitism in the 21st century, what we're seeing with the BDS movement to try to delegitimize Israel, and then what the face of evil is. I think it was so important to have people from both parties, and so far it's been an incredibly impactful trip coming together.
The defender of the people there in Virginia, but you're also concerned about the Jewish people and the rise of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, I call anti-Semitism the world's oldest form of bigotry. And you see it pop up throughout history at some of the darkest chapters in human history. And we've seen a huge uptick. The latest reports, we've seen a huge uptick on anti-Semitism. A lot of it is, candidly, the social isolation we experienced during COVID. People are isolated, and they were hearing very, very dark forces on social media and the web that were really pushing out a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes. And so we're seeing both acts of violence we've seen in the United States, we've seen all over. And we're also seeing a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric, and then we've seen this BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, that's tried to essentially isolate Israel. And think about it, of all the countries that are members of the United Nations, effectively the only country when people question whether they even have a right to be there is Israel. And so it is a constant threat to Israel. And so we've seen both anti-Semitism in Virginia and around the United States, but also we've seen on the international stage anti-Semitism directed towards Israel.
And how will you want to address that anti-Semitism?
Well, as Attorney General, we're the first office to actually set up an anti-Semitism task force with attorneys in our office, both in the criminal and the civil rights and the education division, partially because we've seen so much anti-Semitism on our college campuses. And then we're also working with Governor Glenn Youngkin, who's been a leader on this issue, to get a new definition of anti-Semitism, actually in the Virginia Code, the IRA definition, which I think is so important. And then we're pushing as well anti-BDS legislation that would actually say, listen, if you want to do business with Virginia, you have to be willing to do business with Israel. You can't say you're boycotting them. So I think those are really important measures we're taking to make sure that anti-Semitism has no place in Virginia and that we're standing with Israel.
Yeah, and can you talk about the relationship between Virginia and Israel and how you and the government want to expand that?
Well, we have the Virginia Israeli Advisory Board, and we have a lot of businesses that do businesses in both places. We have a lot of Israeli companies that invest in Virginia. We have one, Interjex, that, for example, does solar panels. But to show how BDS becomes a domestic issue, we have an Israeli company that when they try to install solar panels in certain areas of the Commonwealth, you have anti-Israeli demonstrators show up at local zoning meetings to oppose them. And so it directly is affecting their ability, and they want to expand in Virginia, but you're seeing how you have this interplay of the international with the domestic, where you have an international company who wants to create jobs in Virginia, but they're running into this BDS headwinds. So those are really important that we work with our companies because, as Governor Youngkin loves to say, Virginia is open for business. We want to encourage businesses to grow and thrive and, most importantly, hire, and that's what we want to do.
And you want to expand this economic relationship with Israel?
Yeah, I know that Governor Youngkin's planning on doing a trip to Israel later this year on expanding our economic ties, and I look forward to see what he brings back.
Yeah. And what about some of the domestic issues there in Virginia? You're dealing with a lot of, quite a lot of issues.
Well, it seems like education becomes and continues to be a huge issue in Virginia. It was a huge issue when we ran. We're dealing with a lot in our education system, particularly in Northern Virginia. Obviously, we've investigated, and we have a trial later this year with the former superintendent of Loudoun Schools with the assault that happened there. But candidly, part of my job as the People's Protector is to investigate whether anybody is suffering discrimination regardless of who they are. And we have an anti-discrimination statute in Virginia, the Virginia Human Rights Act. And so we've seen in some of our Northern Virginia schools, a lot of parents have said, hey, I feel like my child's being discriminated against because they're Asian, because they're Asian American. And we know, for example, in Fairfax, they hired an equity consultant, paid this person $455,000 for about 9 months of work. And the equity consultant said, hey, equal outcomes for every student without exception, even if it means you have to treat some students purposefully unequally. I don't want any child to be treated purposefully unequally. And I particularly don't want it if it's because of who they are. And so you saw at a magnet school, Thomas Jefferson High School, it's a governor's school. You have to apply, and they adopted this equity admission standards, and you saw a 20-point drop in Asian enrollment in 1 year. So what we've seen is standing up for parents' rights. Parents matter. Standing up for individual dignity, that matters. We do a lot as well against corporate malfeasance. That's another role that we play in the Attorney General's office, but we're proud to play it.
Keeps you busy.
Keeps me very, very busy. Yeah.
You know that one of the biggest issues here in Israel is judicial reform. I don't know if you feel it's appropriate to comment on that or not.
Well, I've been briefed on it. I know that it's a very, very contentious issue. My sincere hope is that both sides can come to the table and have an honest discussion about how they can improve. That should be all of our goals as any elected leaders, whether you're on the bench or whether you are in the legislature. Your goal should be, how are we going to make things better? How are we going to prove it? My hope is that, this is a democracy. I will say this, I have seen the protests, but I actually view that as some of the strength of Israel. Because if you go just 100 miles north or even east and you decide you're going to take the streets to protest your government, you could be taken away in the middle of the night and be arrested. Yeah. And so the fact that Israel is having this debate, the people feel the freedom that they can go to the streets to protest their elected government. I actually think it shows how strong Israel is. Because if you think about it, the Middle East, they're really the only functioning democracy in the Middle East. And so there are about close to 10 million people who live in Israel, surrounded by several hundred million. And the several hundred million don't have that freedom of speech, don't have that freedom of worship, don't have freedom of religion, don't have freedom of press. I actually think the fact that they're having this big debate shows democracy is working.
Last question, Mr. Attorney General. What would you like yourself and many of these Attorney Generals to take back to the United States?
I'd like to see firsthand, first of all, that evil exists. that anti-Semitism has come back through the centuries. To not be naive to think it can never happen again, because Germany is one of the best educated societies in Europe prior to the Holocaust. To also realize how precious Israel is. To be the only functioning democracy in the Middle East, I think, is beyond significant. And to be willing to stand shoulder and shoulder and say, no, we're going to push back on both anti-Semitism and the BDS movement that seeks to, in my opinion, destroy Israel. I think that's so important. And use the tools you have in your office. You know, your state, there's only, every state plus the District of Columbia, there's 51 state attorneys general. And that means you have enormous power because you represent your respective state in federal court, and you have the ability to bring lawsuits against private actors if need be. And so realize that is a special, special power you have. You really are the people's protector. Take that seriously, including protecting our Jewish citizens.
Yeah. Well, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.